Hi folks, welcome to another video. It looks like Westerners are going to wake up defeated in a completely different world without understanding how they even got here. That's because most Westerners have been watching mainstream media forever and have been brainwashed by false narratives, including false religions that make them ignorant about the facts and that actually make them incapable at figuring them out. They have no comprehension of just about anything that happens east of the European Union. So Russia is about to win a pivotal war against Ukraine. And as of now, Russia has seized the Zaporizhia power plant and biolabs that may have well been the start of the next pandemic. And of course, this is all fact checked by the fact checkers to be disinformation campaigns. What does it mean for Russia to win this war, which really it already won? Well, it can mean a wipeout of the globalist presence in the region, or at least the beginning of the end for the globalist agenda. But before we get into this, I want to first thank the New York Times for taking note of my comments online. It looks like the media is no longer able to draw a veil between the West and what the West is truly sponsoring in the rest of the world. And second, I want to thank someone in my Discord who kindly shared this priceless video. I was not aware that Zelensky is this talented, and I really wouldn't have liked to go through life not seeing this. Ukrainians must feel really blessed to have a leader like him. Let's step back a little bit and establish a key equation here. Globalism is Zionism is the Western powers. They are one, meaning they operate under one agenda and have the same goals. How do we know this? Well, a lot of digging, United Nations goals, global trade deals, founders of the oil business, the people behind Big Pharma, etc., and more recently, awareness around COVID and the Great Reset. Ask yourself, who created the United Nations? Franklin Roosevelt and Stalin. Ask yourself, who founded Israel? The same people selling you mortgages and the American dream. Another key question to ask is, who are you not allowed to criticize? When you take the trouble to go back to the root of an issue, you can connect the dots and get a good sense of who's running these agendas. But I have a shortcut tip for you. When you see something like this, you can assume that it is backed by the globalist agenda. That's because globalism and Zionism don't only try to attack countries from the outside, they also want to degenerate societies from within. In fact, I think they're more precious about internal deterioration than they are about external wars. That's why these agendas are so precious about so-called human rights, and they enshrine them in a country's laws, like in the democratic monarchy of Canada, where just about the only thing you can criticize is the weather. And when you start paying close attention, you'll notice that any country that signs a peace deal agreement with Israel begins to roll out these quote-unquote human rights laws, like what's happening in the UAE. Unfortunately, there aren't many Westerners who understand that their governments are run by these globalists, but those who do are watching in exasperation as their societies collapse into degeneracy. Ukraine is the globalist Zionist party that is backed by the West in this war equation. It is backed by NATO and the EU. And seriously, if it isn't clear to you that NATO and the EU are globalist garbage, then you're best doing something else than wasting your time watching this video. And Zelensky himself is a Talmudic Jew, which should put him in good relations with Israel, to say the least. So the purpose of Ukraine is to forward this agenda in the region. It has a factious history with Russia. It is an old history filled with details that cover everything from ethnic territorialism to energy trade. But to be honest, I'm not really interested in these details because they're the same issues that keep coming up over and over in just about any place the globalist West wants to interfere in, like in Venezuela, Iran, and Syria. The agenda wants to control the world's lands and resources, and it uses cover-ups like democracy, human rights, and climate change to bring them under its control. Ukraine is not the only gateway for the globalist agenda, of course. Countries like Georgia, Latvia, Azerbaijan, others in the region, as well as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other GCC countries are all tied up with this agenda. In fact, you can assume that any country listed with the IMF and indebted to the World Bank forwards this agenda. It's part of the conditions of being a debt slave. I can't deny that Putin might also be pushing this agenda. In fact, there are many reasons why he just might be, and we'll get into them in another video. But we also can't deny that Putin could be working against it. We can gauge this from the present war, assuming it's not controlled opposition. And we might also gauge it from, let's say, the cultural differences Russia has with the agenda. But to me, the key is that Putin supports Syria and supported Syria during the war against Israel. And no, it was not a civil war, it was a proxy war against Israel. Syria is one of the last countries that is not indebted to the World Bank. And so supporting Syria against a supposedly massive force like Israel is a big step against the agenda, despite the fact that on the surface, Russia has diplomatic ties with Israel. Many Israelis are also Russian, so Putin would have to manage how it vocalizes any opposition to the illegitimacy of Israel carefully. And so until Syria becomes a World Bank debt slave, this equation holds, and we can't dismiss the possibility that a major effort against globalism and Zionism is underway. The ineffective narrative that Western media is trying to put out against Russia is very similar to the fake narrative put out against Syria during the war. So, the way I see it is that there are two levels to look at this conflict. The first level is the on the ground political and economic disputes, and the second level is the globalist agenda playing out behind the scenes. On the ground, there are two opposing axes. The first one is the Zionist axis that supports the presence of Israel, the US, and the globalist West in the region. And the second axis is the one that opposes their illegitimate presence. Like I just said, the axis that supports Israel includes Arabian Gulf countries like Saudi, the UAE, countries like Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Ukraine. And the axis that opposes Israel and is actively fighting it includes Syria, Iran, and the Hezbollah militia in Lebanon. And because Russia supports Syria and China has various deals with Iran and Russia, it may well be the case that Russia and China are, in fact, opposed to the Zionist axis. And yes, of course, I appreciate that things are not black and white like that. But when push comes to shove and war breaks out and escalates, things might have to become black and white. And so, this might be an opportunity to draw a hard line with globalism and Zionism. Why do I think that Russia will win this, already won this? Well, for one, no one is backing Ukraine. All of this Western posturing is not doing anything at all. So much of it is frivolous, lightweight, worthless. They're wasting time at the UN talking and doing nothing. All of these worthless politicians across the globe just blabbing about their support for the Ukraine. None of it does anything to stop the Russian takeover. This really tells us that, in truth, the West doesn't have any cards to play. It's all a big deception. They're flailing around with no ammunition. And so, what if the EU takes in the Ukraine? They'll send in their globalist military to Russia. If European militaries were up to the job, they would have already been sent in. All this empty posturing is a poor attempt at deception. Their tanks are empty, they have no bullets to fire. And Zelensky continues to beg for help, and now that Russia has seized the nuclear plant, he's getting even more desperate. And now another mass migration is underway. Canada must be very excited, and I can imagine how the Europeans and British can't wait to receive Ukrainian refugees. And all those sanctions, like banning Russia from SWIFT, are just going to strengthen Russia's alternative systems and its ties with China and other countries in the region. They are already being worked with China and Iran in all sorts of trade deals. Keep in mind that China and Russia and Iran have already been trading outside of the dollar for a long time. And some deals are even on a barter basis, apparently, which can get them out of the banking system altogether. This is also a dollar war on the back end, and yes, the West will lose hard at this. It's just a matter of time and rolling over into the new currency. Will that be a digital currency? Truly, it is foolish and pitiful for the Zio West to think that Putin would have opened the floodgates of a war like this one without having planned it across every possible level and front. The Zionist Western presence continues to be just as hopelessly stupid despite having been in the region for a long time. Airheads like John Bolton and Lindsey Graham, along with circus leader Trump, friend of the Clintons and Bushes, continue to make tragic mistakes without having the slightest comprehension that the East has existed for millennia, is endlessly patient, and has a far longer-term view on all affairs. For example, why should Iran wipe out the Arabian Gulf when it can just wait for these fools to be depopulated within a couple of generations? Another reason why I think Russia will win this by a landslide is because it already has. If the globalist Zionist axis was able to win this, it would have won against Syria. The war on Syria is part of the same effort to subjugate the region to the Zionist World Bank agenda, but they failed.
In the past, what has happened is the neocons and the war caucus has really wanted to topple Assad, and they haven't wanted to talk to Assad. Assad now has essentially won the war, for better or worse. He's staying. So Assad needs to be part of the peace deal. And I'm glad the vice president is talking to the Syrian regime, because if you don't talk to them, there'll never be peace.
Senator, is this in the U.S.'s national interest to pull out of Syria?
It's not in our national interest to be there, period. The president was very clear that the purpose was to defeat ISIS, not to create a nation out of Syria. Syria is a mess, and really Syria is more of a mess because of all the outside intervention.
The war against Syria was a long and tragic 10-year war, and yes, Syria paid a very high price and continues to struggle under sanctions. But if Syria lost, it wouldn't look like what it is today. Losing to Israel and/or signing a peace deal with Israel turns a country into what the Arabian Gulf looks like. Lots of tacky developments sponsored by the IMF, quote-unquote human rights laws, and a debt bubble being pumped up to the max, to mention just a few things of what it means to be a debt slave to the World Bank. Some people say Syria has been sold to Russia. It's typically those who support Israel who say things like that. Yes, many deals were brokered with Russia and Iran, but first, they're all on the same page about not wanting Western and Zionist presence in the region, and second, deals are brokered everywhere, like renting a port somewhere for 50 years. It happens all the time. And notice that Israel didn't even show much support to Ukraine, barely signing off the UN resolution to get Russia out of Ukraine, as if that even matters. Why would Israel hold back like that? Because Israel knows that it may well be next on the list to be bombed out of existence. This is not a border war between Russia and Ukraine, or even just an energy war between Russia and Europe. This may well be a war against the globalist Zionist presence in the entire region. As Russia wins this, and assuming Russia is working against the New World Order agenda, then this may just be a turning point for the world. An opportunity perhaps to dissolve the greatest evil humanity has ever known.